8th anniversary of the Upper Valley Haven. I'm Michael Redmond, the current executive director of the Haven, and on behalf of the employees, the volunteers, the board of directors, thank you for attending today. Today's featured speaker is John Sayles. His topic is Food Security is an Equity Issue, Feeding Neighbors with a Racial and Economic Justice Lens. More in a bit about John. First, some housekeeping. Our session is being recorded, so folks who are unable to attend today can watch at a more convenient time. Due to the size of our audience, as you've noticed, we're using the Zoom webinar format. Everyone has been automatically placed on mute. John welcomes questions and has provided time at the end of his talk to respond. Please write your questions either the chat section or the Q&A, and we'll get as many as we can. As mentioned, we're here today to celebrate the founding of the Upper Valley Haven, its work and role in the community for over the past 40 years. On December 8th, 1980, the Upper Valley's board of directors signed articles of incorporation to form a new nonprofit corporation. This board group included leadership and members of local churches who had been meeting informally since September in pursuit of a common goal, providing temporary shelter in the Upper Valley to those who were in need. By December, they were ready to make it official, and according to minutes from one of their early meetings, quote, put their faith to work for an emergency shelter. They opened their doors to their first guests almost exactly a year later, December 15th, 1981, just a month away from our 40th anniversary. Fittingly, for an ecumenical organization, the Haven's first live-in host couple, Donna and Cordy Church, welcomed a family of 7 whose last name was Bishop. Can't make these things up. Since the early days, we've grown in number of staff, breadth, depths of services, number of buildings on our campus, and certainly a focus on food as one of the areas that the Haven works as part of its mission. While these and many other changes have occurred, what's remained consistent is our mission that can simply be stated: no one should be hungry, everyone should have a home. The story about the founding of the Haven is the first of 40 stories that we've been sharing since the beginning of the year about the people, events, ideas, and services fundamental to our mission. 35 so far have been posted, including one just this morning. 5 to go. We'll place a link in the series that can be found on our website in the chat. Turning to our featured speaker, John Sayles joined the Vermont Foodbank as CEO in March of 2009 after serving 10 years in senior appointed positions with the State of Vermont Agency of Natural Resources, and prior to that in the Department of Public Service. John's active with Feeding America, serving as a member of its national board and on numerous committees and task forces. He was presented the 2012 Dick Goebel Public Service Award by Feeding America for contributions in public policy development, and is currently vice chair of the Feeding America Eastern Region and a member of the Food Sourcing Advisory Committee. Outside his responsibilities of the food bank, John serves on the boards of One Care Vermont, the Vermont Health Foundation, and the Vermont Business Roundtable. Prior to coming to Vermont, John practiced law in Maryland, both in private and government practice. He's a graduate of the University of Baltimore School of Law and Frostburg State University. John moved to Vermont in 1999 and lives in Montpelier. Thank you, John, for agreeing to be the third speaker in our series.
And thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here. Thanks, everybody. I am John Sayles, CEO of the Vermont Foodbank, and I'm going to do that technically challenging transition. Hopefully everything will work well. Can people see my presentation? I would ask.
Yes, we can.
All right, great. Now let me just get my camera in the right place. Wonderful. And I can get started. Thank you very much. As Michael said, my topic today is food insecurity is an equity issue. Feeding neighbors with a racial and economic justice lens. And at the Vermont Foodbank, we have been really on an intentional journey around equity since about 2018. And with that, we are very, very much just beginning. And I'm going to share with you some of my learnings and my thoughts and feelings around how equity really is a key issue in food insecurity and food security. And some of the things, just the initial things the food bank is doing as we work to change our culture and what we can do in the future. So with that, make sure I can. I just need to make one adjustment so I can transition my slides. There we go. So why we're partners, it's great to hear the story of and such an amazing organization doing such great work in your community for 40 years. You know, when I look at the visions of our organizations, I see a lot of parallels. The Vermont Foodbank's vision is one where everyone has equal access to enough food every day, nourishing food, that everyone takes action to end hunger and poverty, and everyone has what they need to thrive. Food is one of Upper Valley Haven's 4 pillars, and as Michael said, it's a key part of Upper Valley Haven's service to the community. And we've been partnering together for decades around making sure that there is enough of the right kinds of food in our community so that everyone can have the food that they need for themselves and their families. It's hard to imagine communities in Vermont without this work. The Vermont Foodbank's vision is we use results-based accountability, and it's a population level outcome, which means it takes the whole community to bring this vision into being. This is not something that one organization, certainly not just the Vermont Food Bank, can do. That's why we rely on community partners. Together, we can make this vision a reality for the state. I want to talk a little bit about the Vermont Food Bank for those of you who might not be as familiar with it. We are an organization that's been around for about 35 years. Actually, Upper Valley Haven had its first guests in 1981. I think the food bank probably distributed its first food in 1983, all coinciding with some changes in our society, and particularly some political transitions that started reducing some of the help that was available to people with low incomes in our communities. The food bank was actually created by organizations like the Upper Valley Haven in Central Vermont who couldn't source enough food, and so they got together and created the food bank to be that larger sourcer of food. Today, we do a lot more than that. You can see our network partner distribution program. So we have the Upper Valley Haven and about over 200 other food shelves and meal sites, homeless shelters, after-school centers, senior centers around the state, as well as schools and hospitals, which bring our total partners up to about 300 in the state of Vermont. We do distribute food. Last year, in the big COVID year, it was about 19 million pounds of food in 2020 that was distributed. Probably this year will be a little bit down, maybe 17, 18 million. And we'll see where we go from here. Veggie Van Go is our local mobile fresh food distribution, which we mostly do at schools and hospitals around the state. The backpack program you may be familiar with is a bag of shelf-stable, kid-friendly foods that get distributed in, I think about over 50 schools around the state every Friday afternoon to make sure that kids have some food over the weekend. Of course, that's been disrupted by everything else by COVID. VT Fresh is a program of nutrition education and cooking demonstrations and supporting our food shelf partners in creating an atmosphere, a welcoming and atmosphere for all of our neighbors and guests that come in. Community Kitchen Academy is a 7-week culinary training program that makes food otherwise go to waste and transforms it into beautiful meals that get served at the Feeding Chittenden food shelf, where we partner with Community Kitchen Academy, and also at the Capstone Community Action Berry facility. A lot of our food comes from Vermont farms and Vermont producers and Vermont manufacturers, and some of it comes from gleaning, where we actually partner with farmers and volunteers, go out in the fields and harvest what wouldn't otherwise be harvested. I know in the Upper Valley you have Willing Hands, which is a tremendous partner, both of all of you and of the food bank. And so the food bank does that work in some parts of the state. We also support Three Squares Vermont benefits by doing application assistance with folks. So we'll sit with you on the phone, go over to your homes in some cases, sit down, help you fill out the application. We will work with you to get that submitted to the state and just make sure that you get that card. We all know that Three Squares Vermont and the SNAP program is the most efficient and effective anti-hunger program we have in this country. Recently, benefits were increased, which is a great thing. I'd still love to see the program available to more people. You know, on this equity journey, we're not alone. We're with lots of you. We're with our national organization, Feeding America, with food banks across the country. And we're really working for ways to partner better with communities to better serve the people in our communities. We are all in this together. As we get started, it's always important for me to kind of set the baseline. And I know when talking about equity and justice, there are a lot of different definitions out there. So I just wanted to let you know what my definitions were. To me, really racial justice and economic justice, the basis is justice. And in doing some research on this a few years back for one of our hunger action conferences, I came upon this definition of justice. And it said that the most plausible candidate for a core definition comes from the Institutes of Justinian, which is a codification of Roman law from the 6th century AD, where justice is defined as, quote, the constant and perpetual will to render to each his due. I think it's important to offer my basic definition of both racial and economic justice. These seem about right to me. So racial justice, again, that constant and perpetual will to render to each his due, their due, really systematic, fair treatment of people of any race, and making sure there are equitable outcomes for all and equitable opportunities for all. Like any kind of justice, it has to be proactive. It's not a theory that sits on a shelf. It's in action. It's about power, access, opportunity, impacts, and most of all, outcomes. Likewise, economic justice is a moral and ethical principle that's put into action. And the ultimate goal is for each person to have that sufficient material foundation on which to have, I like this, a dignified, productive, and creative life. And that the Upper Valley Haven houses people and works to make sure that everyone has a place to live and everyone has food is really important. I'm proud to be a partner. Another basic assumption, really, in my view, is that particularly in the US, food insecurity is really just financial insecurity. Even in food deserts, it's really a matter of transportation costs and time that leaves families without enough food. Broad food scarcity really hasn't existed in this country in a long, long time. Perhaps somewhat during the Great Depression, but certainly not since then. We have an abundance of food. And as you can see from this chart, economic hardship tends to fall the hardest on those with low incomes. So it's a compounding factor. There is a cycle of economic insecurity that results in housing insecurity and food insecurity. And we have to do something about that if we're going to, in the long term, really solve hunger. And speaking of that, you know, I hear people say this all the time. People I meet, groups I talk to, donors, government officials say, well, there will always be hunger. In fact, in the past, I may have said it myself. But, you know, having been with the Vermont Foodbank for 13 years and all I've learned and seen, and particularly now with the lens of equity and justice that's being applied so broadly, I simply don't believe it's true. I believe this, that hunger is the world's greatest solvable problem. A number of years ago at a Feeding America conference, Howard Buffett was a guest. Howard's a farmer and a supporter of Feeding America, and is also a son of Warren Buffett, the famously rich Oracle of Omaha. So when Howard spoke at the Feeding America conference, this is what he said. He said, "There's plenty of food in this country. There's plenty of money. All we lack is the political will to end hunger." The work that we do together to make sure that people are fed and have shelter today, I believe, is a humanitarian necessity. Solving hunger and solving other problems like homelessness is really a moral necessity. And it's the result of just systems. It's the result of economic justice, of racial justice, of equity in general. And why equity? Why are we talking about equity and racial justice? Well, I believe that racism, poverty, and hunger are all interconnected. And what I'm going to do right now is go through kind of my 60-second encapsulation on racism, poverty, hunger. There aren't any citations, but I'm glad to dig into it on the Q&A and share my thoughts later. But these are some basic beliefs that underpin what I'm talking about here. And it colors how I see economic and racial justice being closely tied together and tied to hunger. So the concept of race was actually created by people in the 14th or 15th century to maintain one group's systemic power over another in marginalizing one of the groups. Racism, this is my definition of racism, is the enforcement of that power dynamic. A group that's in power and groups in power use custom, they use laws and set up systems in which the default state for that marginalized group is economic poverty. And as I said before, I think that at least in this country, food insecurity is financial insecurity. So hunger is the result of a lack of money. Another interesting statistic fact is that people who experience discrimination are almost twice as likely to experience hunger. And I'll show you some of those numbers in a minute. Now, the sustainable solution to this is really pull hunger out at the roots. And the deepest root, I believe, is racism and the systems that we've created that sustains it. And ripping the roots out of hunger is a tangled mess. It's not like pulling out your tomato plants or things from your garden in the fall. It looks more like this ball of roots. It's like pulling out this tangled mess of tree roots with your bare hands. It will not be done quickly and it will not be done easily, but working together, there's also a food system which has a big impact on how we eat and what we eat and who can eat. And again, my definition of racism is the enforcement of that power dynamic that marginalizes a group. And there is racism in the food system. It's inevitably one of those tangled roots of hunger. Marginalized people and the oppression results in the loss of agency over food production and food access. I just thought this was a stunning statistic that in 1910, Black farmers owned 16 to 19 million acres of farmland in this country. By 1997, it was just 1.5 million. And actually, it's gone up some since then. This is all from a study done at the behest of USDA. There's no way that this can't have an impact on how people feed themselves, and this topic is its own field of study. We don't even have time to scratch the surface here on this. The brief that's linked there is from Food First, and it's a really good overview I think needless to say, in this country, human bondage and systemic racist policies have kept BIPOC people from owning land, from becoming part of the food system, growing, processing, marketing the kinds of culturally appropriate foods that those communities want, and as importantly, growing wealth by creating companies and serving wider markets. Being held back and denied opportunities for literally hundreds of years has put BIPOC communities at really severe disadvantages. It's going to take decades of intentional work to build back what really was simply not permitted to happen by the dominant culture. The statistics are clear. This is USDA data from 2001 through 2018, and you can see, regardless of COVID, the Great Recession, Black and Hispanic families and people have twice the rate of food insecurity as non-Hispanic white people. Food insecurity has been consistently higher for those groups too, prior to and after this chart. Feeding America also does a lot of research, and really study after study just confirms this, that BIPOC, Native American, Black, Pacific Islander, Latino citizens in this country have consistently much higher and double the levels of food insecurity as other groups. There has to be a reason for that. And food banking, we'll talk about food banking. Food banking's roots are in that dominant culture. I have here, food banking has been around for about 50 years, more or less, founded as charities to help find a home that didn't otherwise have a home, or take donated food and get it to people. I have the graphic from St. Mary's Food Bank up here, because St. Mary's is actually the very first food bank in modern food banking. There was a gentleman named John Van Hengel who in Phoenix, Arizona, ran into a woman behind a grocery store rooting through a dumpster, and started talking to her, and she told him her story that she couldn't afford food, and the grocery store was throwing away a lot of perfectly edible food. So this is where she got a lot of her food. Well, John went to St. Mary's Church, St. Mary's Catholic Church in Phoenix, and got them to donate him a little bit of space, and then started going to the food stores and asking them if they would, instead of throwing away the food that was still edible, would donate to him. And he started doing distributions, and basically out of that grew the food banking movement. It grew much bigger in in the 1980s because of government policies that reduced the amount of aid available to people with low incomes, and really increased hunger and increased the demand on all the community-based services that were out there. So we are part of the system. The food banks were in response to what was happening in our society. We didn't at first change the root causes of what was happening. We just addressed the current issue. And that's our model right now. It really is, or has been. I think it's changing. It's been a deficiency model. Donors give to those who are less fortunate. It's kind of a scarcity mindset. It's like, there isn't enough. We have to give more. I think in order to really find food security through justice, we need to change this lens. And we've been talking about how we're going to change this lens at the Vermont Food Bank. And when we started doing that, we really decided we needed to start with ourselves. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about the Vermont Food Bank's path as we've started on this journey of equity and in changing our culture. So marginalized individuals and communities, they have the experience and the wisdom to lead this change. They don't need leaders of the food bank. Communities understand what's happening. We need to listen and learn. I was in Chicago a few years ago for the Collective Impact National Conference and heard a woman, Liz Dozier, who has an organization called Chicago Beyond. And she said these words and they just stuck with me. Do we love the people we serve? Do we trust the genius and the beauty of those we serve? And I think we can trust the genius and beauty of those we serve and listen and learn how we can change our own cultures. We recognize the need to start with ourselves as individuals to understand what are our feelings around equity, racial justice, and economic justice. We're not a monolith at the Vermont Foodbank or in any organization. We have to talk about these things. We have to understand where other people are coming from. At the same time, we need to look at our organization. And since we are an organization that grew up within this system, what practices do we have? What customs and cultures and rules have we internalized from those, racist, really racism-based oppressive systems? And how can we think about things differently? And then once we've done some of that work as individuals and as an organization, and begun the process, because this is going to take a long, long time of really understanding what stands in the way of an equitable, inclusive, and welcoming culture, then we can start reaching out to others in communities and talking about the work with some authenticity. And that's what we're trying to do, what we're starting to do at the Vermont Foodbank, where we know we have to think differently, we need to act differently, systems need to change. While we're still part of that legacy societal system, the food bank has begun our journey. As I said, we started really in earnest, I think, in about 2018, to change some of those systems. And the way we're doing this, the big pillars for us, putting the people that we serve in the center, listening and learning, engaging in policy change, both internally and externally, and shifting that mindset from that scarcity mindset, from that deprivation mindset to the abundance mindset. Because as Howard Buffett said, there's plenty out there. We just lack the political will to do what we need to do. Systems change, yes. It is complex. It is time consuming. It is full of conflict. It is going to take a lot of time. I love this graphic because sure, let's just change some systems. Should be easy, right? No, it's not going to be easy. And we need to really put effort into it. We can't just expect it to happen. We can't expect to change a few outward things and expect that really deep change just to happen. We all have to work for it. It's a practice. Oh, and it's a paradox because it's a work in progress. It's going to take time. It's also extremely urgent. The Vermont Foodbank as a white-led organization has really just begun understanding the systems that need to change and the systems change and doing the work. It can feel both like it's going too fast. I don't understand what's happening. And like it's going at a glacial pace. Nothing is changing. Why aren't you moving more quickly? At the same time, that need for change is urgent. The results of that change can be transformational in communities to our neighbors. There can be, the analysis paralysis, where we look at that chart and say, how am I going to get through that? But we also need to move forward, because we need to stop doing more damage, because these systems are doing damage every day. We need to make tangible progress. Again, it's going to take focus and effort. So I just want to talk about some examples of how we can do this, how we are doing this, taking some first steps at the Vermont Foodbank. Putting the people we serve in the center. Well, we've started some projects, some pilot projects. We do a culturally responsive food delivery pilot program that we've done in the Burlington area, working with with farmers in the Intervale, growing vegetables that are culturally appropriate for the Somali and Nepalese New American communities, working with the Janet Munt Family Room in Burlington to connect shares, CSA shares of these vegetables with families. And then the family room is delivering them to the families, particularly during COVID. Oftentimes there's a mom at home with multiple kids, and it's even hard to get out, even if it wasn't a pandemic. We've partnered with UVM to do surveys of the people that are receiving the food to find out, is this the food that you want? Is it enough? Is it not enough? Would you like it in a different form, delivered in a different way? There's other things too, where purchasing from New American farmers to make sure that those culturally appropriate foods are available in our food shelf partners around the state, and also supporting those communities, the New American communities, in creating their own food culture in our state. We started some regional advisory boards from people who are receiving food in communities, to hear directly from people, to listen. And our mission really is to create those feedback loops that are necessary. So we're getting back to people and saying, we heard you, here's what changed, and here's what you should be seeing differently in your community. And then valuing the lived and living experience with hunger in our hiring process, in our process for bringing board members on, actually asking people if they've had experience with food insecurity. What do they think it looks like? How has it shown up in their life? Whether it has or it hasn't, just understanding that about each other creates a different atmosphere and a different way to work together. So right now, in these early days, it's a lot of listening. There's also policy changes, and the food bank is making some policy changes internally at first, because that's what we have control over. Certainly advocating for and having a little bit of success in policy changes at the state and federal level. But one of the things that's changed is how we make grants to our network partners and other groups. Understanding that grant processes can be complicated and are based in rules-based systems. How can we make it easier? And make sure that people are getting what they need, but that there is accountability, because I believe accountability is really important. We've developed a very short and simple grant application, and very minimal grant reporting, because we basically know the organizations that we're interacting with, and we know what they're doing. We don't need them to give us detailed reports on what they've done with the money. We're watching it happen in real time. The organizational resource team at the Vermont Foodbank, in times past, policy decisions that affected the entire organization were made, by a group of executives sitting in a room. And we realized that we needed more voices at the table to make better decisions. And so we reached into every level of the organization, all of our different locations, and created a larger group that now processes through changes like any kind of policy that's going to affect everyone in the organization. So what days we shut down, how we do our trainings, some of the things you see in HR policies, the parental leave, holidays, how we pay each other, our compensation philosophy, all that goes through the organizational resource team. And then this is going to be a theme, I think, for a long time, just diversifying our staff, our board, and continuing on this DEI journey. Equity, inclusion, belonging. It's going to take a while for us to work through the issues that we have, both as an organization, as a state, and as a country. And then the abundance mindset. So expanding the definition of who a partner is. It used to be partners were food shelves and meal sites and senior centers. Now partners include the Susu Community Collective Farm in Brattleboro. Partners are the Association of Africans Living in Vermont, Outright Vermont, migrant justice, in addition to folks like Willing Hands, the Upper Valley Haven, Capstone Community Action, the Intervale. So we really need to think more broadly about who a partner is. I talked about grants, more direct grants to network partners and community partners. To the extent that the food bank has more capacity to raise money, we also have the obligation to make sure that that money is deployed in a thoughtful way in the community, in a way that's going to make change. And that doesn't always mean going to food bank programs. Sometimes it means supporting communities in the work that they're doing that's lifting the community up and creating more sustainability. And then our core work, making more food available at more locations. During COVID, we've increased the number of Veggie Van Go points by 30%. There's a Veggie Van Go right at the Veterans Hospital just down the road from the Upper Valley Haven. We've added different kinds of products. We've added worked with a donor, and now we provide menstrual products to our network partners. You can order them on our ordering site, and they'll be going to schools, to school pantries, because period poverty is a real thing, and it's something that we're in a position to be able to help with. It's that abundance mindset. What can we do in our communities? Again, you'll notice this is made easier when there's financial resources, but I believe that the abundance mindset also helps bring in more financial resources. Now, all of this is really not without accountability. Yes, the buck actually needs to stop somewhere. Really, to sustain this work, we need to be held accountable. We need to be held accountable to each other. We need to be held accountable to the people that we're serving. There are some accountability structures already in place. Feeding America, our national organization, is working very hard on these justice and equity issues, and they hold us accountable. Our board, our donors, our partners like the Upper Valley Haven, and just our public presence is a way for the food bank to hold ourselves accountable. Transparency is very important in this, and making a commitment to be transparent about our equity and racial justice commitments to the community. Ultimately, we'll become more accountable the more we create community feedback loops. And there's community-driven decision-making. And then the community will come back and say, hey, we made this decision. Show me how you implemented that. And finally, being in relationship with other organizations that are working to center equity, both internally and externally in all they do, keeps us accountable for moving forward. It's a privilege to do this work. It's hard work. I could say in an age of reckoning. I don't know where this country or this world is going to be in 1 year or 5 years or 10 years. But I do know that the journey that our organization has started on in addressing hunger through a lens of equity and racial and economic justice is something that we can't turn back from now. It's like when how can I stop seeing that? How can I stop learning that? You can't stop learning that. And we look forward to working with you all on this call, with the Upper Valley Haven, with all of our network partners, with the state government, with the federal government, with private businesses, with everyone, to really find that solution to hunger in our state. And then finally, I just again want to thank the Upper Valley Haven for really being a force for justice in our community for the last 40 years. I would say I look forward to the next 40, but I would love for all of us to go out of business. We'll see where we go with that. I think that regardless of how well we do in supporting all of our neighbors in their basic needs, there probably will always be somebody falling off the edge of whatever supports are there. I think the key is that we have a community support network in place that can catch people quickly, so that they never really have to experience hunger or homelessness for more than a day. I really look forward to hearing your questions. Here's my contact information. If you don't get your question answered or you want to dig more deeply into something, feel free to give me a call or shoot me an email. And with that, I will turn it back over to Michael for questions.
Great. Thank you, John. We'll put down the slides and look at each other, and but not the whole audience. Thank you. A lot of good thoughts and presented in ways that we don't often think about food as of work. I'd like to raise my question that I had, John, because of your focus on income as a solution. When we think about how we address hunger in this country, there seems to be two models. One, the charitable food programs that you and I work in, and then there's income supports like SNAP and WIC and the programs for seniors. And I wondered if you wanted to comment on just maybe it might be informational for the audience as well as to the relative size and the importance of each of these strategies of dealing with hunger in the country.
Sure. Yeah, I'll start with SNAP because I probably know the most about SNAP. It is by 10 times the largest food security program in the country. I think this was a pre-COVID statistic, but for every meal that the Feeding America network, which is 200 food banks across the country, the majority of food banks in this country, for every meal that the Feeding America network provides, SNAP provides 9 meals. In Vermont alone, and again, these are pre-COVID numbers, but I believe that SNAP was bringing in something close to $120 million a month of resources spent on food. I'm sorry, $120 million a year of resources spent on food in Vermont, and that's spent at local retailers, at our local grocery stores, at our co-ops, at our farmers markets. That's supporting the local economy. And then there's, WIC, which really focuses on the nutritional needs of small children and their moms. I think those income support programs, really are a much more dignified answer also to people's needs than with all due respect, homeless shelters and food shelves, and going to a veggie van go. I actually am a fan of the concept of universal basic income, where we could actually, instead of slicing and dicing and means testing all these programs, whether it be SNAP or WIC or Section 8 vouchers, that we just really have more trust in people and provide them with income supports without all the strings attached.
John, we did get a few questions that talked about Vermont or the Upper Valley as a less diverse place. And Jennifer, my colleague here, wrote, "The Upper Valley is not as diverse a community as some of the United States, so some issues do not seem as visible to the general public. What specifically can we do as local citizens to support food sovereignty here, especially for BIPOC community members?" And Donald wrote, "John, as you know, Vermont is one of the least racially diverse states in the nation. Can you speak about how you frame diversity in other terms, perhaps as related to rurality? And could you speak about hunger and justice in our First Nation brothers and sisters?"
Yeah. As I talk about racial justice and diversity and equity in Vermont, I think we all often hear, but is it really a problem here? Because we really don't have the kind of racial diversity that other places do. And my first reaction to that is always, well, why do you think that is? Why do we have, I think our census is something like 32,000 BIPOC individuals living in Vermont. That's a big number. people. It feels different than a percent. But you know, the question I ask is, why do you think we have a lower number of BIPOC peoples in Vermont? And I think, to me, the reason is that we're not really as welcoming a community as we seem to think that we are, and that we really need to, again, look at our systems, not from our perspective of well, you know, I smile at the Black person that I see at the store, but from the perspectives of the people of color in this state. And it doesn't take many people who aren't welcoming, or many systems that aren't welcoming, to sour people on being in Vermont. So you know, if you look at Susanna Davis, who's the racial equity director for the governor's office, you know, at some of the statistics she's thrown out about the opportunities for population growth in Vermont, it's almost entirely people of color coming to this state. And we need to, through their eyes, through the eyes of people of color, see whether we're welcoming or not, and change our system so that we actually are. I think that when it comes to Indigenous peoples in Vermont, it's so interesting. You know, the major groups of Indigenous peoples are Abenaki groups and bands, who have suffered, you know, really, really horrible indignities over the decades and centuries here. You know, just recently the legislature talked about the eugenics movement and the sterilizations that took place, and some of that was targeted at our Abenaki neighbors. And I think that the work that we've been doing and trying to do, and through our partners with the community, I think the Abenaki community is rightly a little bit suspicious. And it's going to take some time to build relationships in those communities. And I think we just need to make that effort, and to be patient and build community. And I would say the same thing about you know, other BIPOC groups in Vermont. Is if you don't see many in your community, then you need to search out people, and you need to listen. Don't say what's available here or what a great place this is. Ask questions and listen to what their experience is. It may be great, and if so, then we should find the things we're doing well and do more of them. But if there are things that aren't going well, then we need to think critically ourselves about what we're going to change.
And John, to Donald's point on rurality, that we're non-metropolitan and small town communities, are there special issues that you see in your work, or in the or maybe in the systemic aspects of food insecurity?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, we talk about this a lot at the national level, Feeding America level too, because, you know, we're an organization of food banks like the Vermont Foodbank, which is, you know, Vermont is one of the most rural states in the country. And, you know, food banks in places like Dallas and LA and Chicago, Washington, DC, the challenges are very, very different. And in Vermont, you know, the experience of someone who's food insecure, who's maybe, you know, 87 years old and lives in the Northeast Kingdom, is a very different experience than, you know, a Somali New American family in the Burlington area, which is still different from, you know, a family with two small kids living in Peru, and, you know, maybe working in the forest products industry. So as many places as there are stories, and being rural, as we all know, the challenge with food insecurity is often transportation, and being able, the way our systems work is, you know, if you can get to the food at the time when it's available, then whatever's there is there for you. And we need to think differently, I think, with this abundance mindset about how do we get the food closer to the people that we're serving. So get the food that people want where they want it, when they want it.
Thank you, John. We've just recently worked on our strategic plan with a focus on our major areas of service, including food, and that is one of our conclusions was that to do more, which we've been doing over the past a few years, is more support to other local food pantries, working with hospitals and other health organizations where people gather and where there might be opportunity to go to where they are and where they might be where there's some screening for food insecurity that's occurring, and that's been and that's shaping as we look at the world. And I think the focus on listening to the customers or those who you serve is also a large component of our work going forward. So I'm glad we're heading on the right path. I respect your ideas and your thinking. So here's a question. It's a little bit. You brought a lot of pride to this state of Vermont when you, I mean, some other progressive food banks in other states was selected by Mackenzie Scott for a major grant. How has that affected the organization, and how have you been thinking about how to use that to support your mission?
Yeah, in some ways it changed everything, and in some ways it didn't change anything. And we were very honored, and really, I've said this before, that I consider that gift to be a gift to the state of Vermont, and not just something that came to the food bank. I think Mackenzie Scott has made it clear with her giving pattern that that equity and racial justice are extremely important to her, and we want to honor that. So what we've done with the gift is actually create a plan around it. And 75% of that gift is going toward our core work, and really this surge. The gift came in December 2020, just as COVID was taking off, or in the midst of COVID's takeoff, and so it gave us the confidence to know that we'll be able to continue to serve Vermont at the level we need to for the near future. And so it was kind of that. Lots of other donors were there too, and really have powered the response across the state. But the Mackenzie Scott gift was a big deal. And so we divided up into 3 buckets, and one is that expanded core work. So making sure that we're, this is going to last a couple more years, the tail from COVID, if not longer. And we need to be able to provide that higher level of service and make sure that the food's available. The second bucket is, these are just starting, is deeper community work. So Michael, you were talking about, the work that's very parallel to what the food bank's doing, that you're doing, listening, reaching out, going where the people are, working with willing hands to get the kinds of foods that people really want and need in their communities. The food bank is making a concerted effort to reach out to some more underserved communities in Vermont and try and create that momentum and create systems around the community building itself up. I know there was, over the years, there's been a collective impact initiative in the Upper Valley where you've kind of organized yourselves and learned about how do we take all the different organizations and put them at the service of the people who need assistance or who are looking for making changes in their lives. We want to help build that kind of infrastructure in other communities in the state. So a piece of the Mackenzie Scott money is going to that, and actually we're in the process of hiring a coordinator to do that work, and we're hoping to kick off the first project coming up very early in the new year. And then the last bucket is what we're calling the innovation lab. So the food bank's going to create a food security innovation lab where we can try some things, kind of like risk capital. So giving ourselves permission to try something that we wouldn't have otherwise tried, and maybe we'll fail, and then we'll have to move on to the next thing. But if we don't try it, we'll never know. And so in all 3 of these buckets, like I said, about 75% of this is going towards making sure that we're still here. And there's a lot of innovation and cool stuff going on in that core work too, but also building, strengthening communities, and doing this innovation work. We're going out to donors also and saying, hey, we've taken this McKinsey Scott gift and we've allocated pieces to these 3 buckets. Will you join us? And if we say have more money in the community bucket, we can do more. And here's what our vision is. And it's been really great. We've been having a good response, and donors are coming aboard, and we're going to be able to do more than we would do. We're kind of leveraging and multiplying this McKinsey Scott gift.
That's great. Jim asked a question, really tying it to another idea where the Haven touches lives, about using the thought of housing first, meaning don't try to fix people, but find them housing if that's what they need. Is there equivalent for food? I wonder, maybe universal school meals is something that if kids go to school, there should be food for everyone. Or what do you think about that?
Well, that's definitely food first is a movement too.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
There are some food banks who are branding things around food first. So it's really a concept of just providing all of a family's food needs. Mm-hmm. So they come, once a week or more often to a certain location, like going grocery shopping, and all of their food needs are met without having to go to the grocery store. And that's one of those innovations we could look at. But I also very much agree with housing first, and I think that there are opportunities, there are untapped opportunities for partnerships with other food organizations in Vermont, including Vermont Foodbank, to make sure when people get housing first, that close behind is their food needs, and that we're there making sure that the resources are there. Again, it's all about financial insecurity. And if you're filling buckets, if you're filling the housing bucket and filling the food bucket, that leaves whatever income there is for other needs.
Yes, we often talk to our donors about, yes, people are hungry, but most that who come to the Haven, but really, I think if I was to characterize it as they're trying to get by and balance their budgets. And if we can provide a source of food for them, that helps, particularly in times of rising costs. And so we anticipate a lot of people coming to our Turkey Day on November 20th, a week from Saturday, and because of the cost of food and the continuing. Yeah. You mentioned earlier the long tail of COVID too. I recall that at one point it was 30% in food insecurity being measured in Vermont, rather than the usual 11 or 12% usual we shouldn't tolerate, but there it is. What do you think going forward? Do you think that tail will be reflected in higher levels of food insecurity for a few years?
I do think so. That's certainly what we saw after the Great Recession. And the folks at UVM who are following this, their latest data shows that we're still about, I think it was 23% above pre-COVID food insecurity numbers here in Vermont. And we all know, or at least Michael, and I know, and our teams know that when a family suffers an economic shock, like a lot did during COVID, even with the stimulus checks and the enhanced unemployment, it takes time to build back from that. It's not something that happens overnight. It takes years when you've spent all your savings to build that back. And, we need to be here.
Thank you, John, for speaking today. You added quite a lot of good thoughts, and for us to reshape and reframe some of our thinking about food and food insecurity through the lens of race and poverty and systems. For everyone, we'll be distributing a recording of today's session, which will include the slides to you, and so look forward to receiving those in a few days. The next speaker in our series is Matt Slaughter, the Paul Danos Dean of the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth and the Earl C. Dahm 1924 Professor of International Business. The title of his talk is What Has Happened to the Well-Being of American Families Over the Past 40 Years. So another systemic look at poverty and in this country. So please join us on December 8th, again, the second Wednesday in December at noon. Registration information can be found on our website. Thank you all for attending, and hope to see you in December. And thank you again, John, for all of your wisdom and your work and of the organization that you've helped to build. Thank you so much.
Likewise, and congratulations on 40 years.
Thank you very much.